There we go. Welcome back from lunch. As Louis said, I'm Michael Greenspan, President of the Inter-America Press Association. I'm also Global Head of Licensing and Print Innovation at the New York Times. IAPA is made up of more than 1,300 print, television, radio, and digital media, press associations, service providers, and individuals. We're very happy to be here today participating in this event because we have a shared objective to promote press freedom and the protection of journalists around the world, and in particular to push for accountability against those who commit crimes against journalists. This session is unique in the sense that it showcases some of the innovative approaches to fighting impunity. As you may know, fighting impunity is one of the most complex and difficult tasks in promoting press freedom. UNESCO statistics indicate that for every 100 journalists, only 14 cases are resolved through the judicial process, putting the impunity rate at 86%. This is unacceptable, and it is incumbent upon all of us to find the ways and means, in particular through the three-pronged strategy of prevention, protection, and prosecution as prescribed in the UN Plan on Action on the Safety of Journalists to combat this problem. In a moment, we'll hear from representatives of some of the organizations that have devised innovative ways in fighting impunity, including memorials, innovative investigative reports, artistic representation, media campaigns, and symbolic trials, among others. They will be sharing with us what they are doing to keep the memory of killed journalists alive and pursue justice for their deaths. To discuss this topic are Evelyn Wickstra, Policy and Advocacy Director, Free Press Unlimited, Barbara Cochran, Fallen Journalist Memorial Foundation, Victor Coelho Munez, Pixel and Pixel, Saleh Marias Kwasi, Network of African Investigative Journalists and Editors, and Janith Bedoya, Colombian journalist from El Tiempo Colombia Memorial. But before inviting our distinguished panel to their seats, we will do two things. First, we will view a video in memory of two French journalists, Ghislaine Dupont and Claude Verlon, who were killed in Mali in 1993. Their killing was the basis for the creation of the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists by the United Nations, now commemorating its 10th anniversary. We will then hopefully hear a testimony from Hoang Safers, team leader of Cambodian female journalists, on the challenges women journalists face in doing their work in Cambodia. But first, to the video.
Il y a effectivement un problème pour les médias de traitement sur l'Afrique. Les médias se déplacent tous en même temps, au moment d'une crise, au moment d'un bain de sang. Et ensuite, tout cela disparaît, l'Afrique disparaît des radars.
La carrière de Ghislaine commence en 1990. Très vite, elle devient une figure du service Afrique. Pour Ghislaine, il ne faut jamais s'arrêter aux évidences, il faut rencontrer toutes les parties. Reporter, enquêtrice, elle traite l'information du continent de l'Est à l'Ouest en passant par l'Afrique centrale où elle pose son micro durant une décennie.
Entreprendre un travail de titan pour répondre aux besoins. Ghislaine Dupont, Djouba, RFI. Ghislaine Dupont, Abidjan, RFI.
Ghislaine Dupont, Kinshasa, RFI. Infatigable tourmenteuse de présidents et de rebelles, ses reportages sont sans complaisance. Elle en paye le prix fort. Expulsée de la République démocratique du Congo avant le premier tour de la présidentielle de 2006. Quelques années plus tard, au Mali, pour la deuxième fois, avec Claude, elle couvre les élections législatives.
Je vous remercie du soutien que vous m'avez apporté pendant ces périodes un peu difficiles.
Et est-ce que tu nous aimes?
Oh non,
j'ai oublié.
Non, je vous aime pas du tout.
Arrivé en 1982 à Radio France, Claude n'est pas que le technicien de reportage. Claude écoutait aussi avec son cœur. Il scrutait avant de capter les sons et savait se placer pour être au plus près du sujet. Toujours souriant, avec la bonne idée pour avoir la bonne matière sonore. Une liaison incertaine avec Paris, il savait être patient et rassuré, même si la connexion arrivait alors que le présentateur en studio faisait déjà le lancement.
Frédéric Misselin, Claude Verlon, Houston, RFI.
Claude Verlon, Sami Bourlifa, Le Caire, RFI.
Avec beaucoup de professionnalisme et un peu de magie, Claude trouvait toujours la solution.
Vérifie parce que tu sais, lui, ça manque toujours de lumière.
Ghislaine Dupont, Claude Verlon, Kidal, RFI.
Assassiné le 2 novembre 2013, c'est le groupe djihadiste Diag Agrali qui revendique l'enlèvement et l'élimination des envoyés spéciaux de RFI. Les manifestations en hommage à Ghislaine et Claude, au Mali ou à Paris, se multiplient. Au Quai Branly, Laurent Fabius, face aux familles, aux collègues et aux amis, s'engage.
La France est déterminée à lutter contre le terrorisme et à tout faire pour que ces criminels soient identifiés, appréhendés et qu'ils répondent de leurs crimes devant la justice.
4 ans plus tard, le même engagement est pris solennellement.
La France met tout en œuvre pour que toute la vérité soit faite sur cette affaire, et la France met tout en œuvre pour pouvoir capturer les autres commanditaires de ces crimes.
En France, l'enquête judiciaire se heurte à la neutralisation par l'armée française des suspects et aux documents qui restent classifiés secret défense. Tous ces obstacles sont des freins pour connaître la vérité sur les circonstances de leur mort. La bataille mémorielle est donc essentielle pour les familles de Ghislaine et Claude. Impossible de faire le deuil sans les réponses. Des conférences de presse sont organisées à Paris, à New York, en Afrique, pour ne pas faire tomber dans l'oubli le crime perpétré au Mali. Ne rien lâcher pour connaître la vérité, faire avancer l'enquête, explorer toutes les pistes. Beaucoup de journalistes et de techniciens sur le continent africain prennent part à cette quête de vérité. Depuis le drame de Kidal, le 2 novembre est chaque année la journée internationale pour la lutte contre l'impunité des crimes commis contre les journalistes. 10 ans après leur engagement devant l'ONU, les États ne tiennent toujours pas leurs promesses.
Hank Sampers, are you here? So, Ms. Sampers, as leader of female journalists in Cambodia, tell us about the unique challenges you face as a woman journalist and what a day like this means for you, your efforts in ensuring a safe working environment for your membership and women journalists everywhere.
Thank you. First, thank you UNESCO, Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the Office of the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, and the Secretary General of the Organization of American States of making this event possible. And good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, and Your Excellency, and honorable guests. I am honored to be here today to stand in front of you as a concerned citizen to voice of concern about media freedom in Cambodia. My name is Hong Sampos, a team leader of Cambodian female journalists in a group of female journalist network in Cambodia. In Cambodia, female represent among 52% of population. In 2021, the Ministry of Information reported that only 470 of female journalists, equal 9.4% among 50,000 journalists in Cambodia, including that women's voice were severely underrepresented in the media sector. Here are the challenges that we are facing as women journalists in Cambodia. There were 3 main concerns such as safety security, lack of mechanism to promote female journalists, and limited capacity of knowledge of women journalists. First, safety security. Workplace harassment. For example, there were a case of Philippine female journalists who put complaint against the publisher of a newspaper in Cambodia. Online violence. For instance, a case of Mr. Pa Sokheng, Voice of Democracy reporter, who got online harassment from a social media influencer. Remember that the Voice of Democracy, VOD, the very few last independent media organizations were closing down through the order of the government this year. Personal safety. Through Cambodian Journalists Alliance Association survey with a group of female journalists in 2021 showed that women journalists are afraid to personal safety when they go into work on field at night. Lack of well-being support. Women journalists rarely receive well-being support. Second, lack of mechanism to protect women journalists. Lack of law or policy to support women in journalism. As seen, most of media newsrooms have not created policy to set quota for women journalists or policy against harassment. Lack of mechanisms such as no press union, no press council, press law is weak to promote women in journalism and without any term to protect them. Lack of internal policy or rule to support capacity to women journalists. Third, limited capacity of knowledge of women journalists. The reason of the limitation are social norm, discrimination, lack of training center, low income, lack of media and journalist school or university, lack of internal rule or policy to support capacity to women journalists, lack of female journalist capacity to network with outside journalist network. So, within the concern, here is why Cambodian female journalists is created because we want to ensure a safe working environment for membership and female journalists in general. In addition, Cambodian female journalists was established to contribute to addressing challenges faced by female journalists in Cambodia through capacity development and providing peer support in order to enhance women participation in journalism and decision-making role. Our mission is to provide to female journalists the opportunity to build and develop their capacity to work professionally without harassment, without intimidation, to get decent pay, social protection, and more leadership role in journalism. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that inspiring testimony. Yes. I'll now invite the panelists to take their seats on stage. Anywhere.
Fill in, huh?
Yes. Wherever you want. Let me start with you, Evelyn. Last year, Free Press Unlimited and other press freedom advocacy organizations concluded what you called the People's Tribunal, which passed judgment in some cases of killed journalists. Tell us more about the People's Tribunal and how symbolic acts, such as trials without the force of law, can contribute to the fight against impunity.
Is it working? Yeah. Thank you so much. So yes, 4 years ago we asked ourselves the question, as civil society actors, what role do we have when a journalist is murdered? And like the years before, as many press freedom organizations, we had been calling out for states to pursue justice in cases of murders of journalists. And this time we decided we need to do something experimental. And we developed a project called A Safer World for the Truth. And the strategy is that we investigate cold cases of journalist murders. So we actually look at what happened, what happened with the murder, but also what happened afterwards, what investigation took place. And also, was there any court case initiated after that? And I must say what we found is actually when we dig deep, so this is not a case of a week or a month where we look at these cases, but it's long term. So it's actually digging deeper into telling this whole story and getting a good idea of what happened and what should be improved. And what we found is actually that two things really matter. So developing this information position where you understand what happened in this murder and also what should be improved to prevent this from happening again. And the other one is actually teaming up with local organizations, local lawyers, and local investigative journalists and creating a kind of group of people who care about this case, who will demand justice, and who also have these ties with the authorities to get cases reopened. And one of the examples we've done in total over the last 3 years, 17 cold case investigations in 16 different countries. And one of the last investigations that we've done was into the murder of Brazilian journalist Pedro Palma. And we actually found that working with this group of organizations and lawyers, and then the Brazilian government actually has a observatory for violence against journalists, and we could present the findings there together with our lawyer and actually get the first steps towards justice. So this has been a really conciliatory approach where we try to engage the authorities to reopen a case to actually achieve justice in that specific case. But actually what they also agree to is in general they will create and develop guidelines for investigating murders of journalists. So this has a wider meaning as well apart from the case of Pedro Palma. Then a more, I would say, aggressive, confrontational approach is when we organized the People's Tribunal on the murder of journalists. And this was really to get instead of like engaging with the authorities, it was really about naming and shaming to a certain degree. So we organized 5 case hearings. So it was actually like a court. And we tried to dig into 3 different murders in 3 different situations where the likeliness of justice is very low. So one of the cases that we looked into was the murder of Syrian journalist Nabil Asharbashi, who was tortured to death in an Assad prison. The other one was the murder of Lasantha Wickrematunge, a Sri Lankan journalist, very well known, who was killed by security forces. And the third was a Mexican journalist, Milo Vela, who was already mentioned today. And this was of course it was a symbolic tribunal. We couldn't really serve justice with the panel of judges. But it was very, I would say, meaningful to the families and to the colleagues of these journalists who were murdered because they felt like they finally had their day in court. They could provide testimony. And we've heard back, even last week, we spoke to one of the daughters of Lasantha, and she told us how much it had meant to them that they actually had this day in court and the global attention to the case of her father's murder. So we saw also actually, apart from this human value of the tribunal, that the case files that we assembled during the tribunal, we could actually convey them to a UN mechanism. But what we learned from this, and I think from if you are thinking of organizing a tribunal, is that the case of the Mexico case the hearing that we did was actually in Mexico, and I think that was very different from the 2 other cases, because it was crucial that for the first time the son and his daughter of Milo Vela spoke out about his murder. And this actually initiated a movement where other families also started to speak up about the murder of their relative. And in Mexico, you already had an institution that was FEATLE, so it was actually an institution you could go to, a special prosecutor for crimes against journalists, and they presented, the 11 families presented these cases to this prosecutor, and these cases are now being reopened. So you see that you actually go from a informal form of justice to a formal form of justice, and we felt that this has been really valuable to do, but we also feel that this more conciliatory approach, where you, in specific countries, there are authorities that you can engage, is also very important, and that's what we will be continuing to do in the following years. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. Let me now turn to Barbara. You're the president of the Fallen Journalists Memorial Foundation, which plans to build a physical monument here in Washington in memory of killed journalists. Tell us more about your project, how memorials can represent memory and accountability for crimes committed against journalists.
Thank you. Thank you. Organizers for Thank you, and thank you so much to the organizers for bringing us all together to discuss this incredibly important topic. And this location is actually very key to the project that I'm involved with to build a memorial here in Washington. This building is sited on the National Mall, which is sometimes called America's front yard. It's the national park. It is a national park, and it is the most visited national park in the U.S., attracting some 25 to 30 million people every year. And if you are a first-time visitor to Washington, or if you've been here many times, you'll know that this mall is ringed with memorials that celebrate historic events, like commemorating wars and those who died in wars. It celebrates individuals who were very important in our history: Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson. But there is no monument until the one that we're working on becomes a reality. There is no monument to an idea, and that is the idea of freedom of the press. And in 2020, Congress authorized our foundation, the Fallen Journalists Memorial Foundation, to build a memorial in Washington that would commemorate America's commitment to freedom of the press by honoring journalists who've sacrificed their lives in service to that cause. That is the language of the law. And so we have a twofold purpose. We are honoring those journalists who died because they were pursuing the truth. And we are also honoring the idea of freedom of the press as a pillar of democracy. 2 years later, in 2022, Congress approved a request from the National Park Service to locate this monument in a very special area right adjacent to the National Mall. And we received that authorization at the end of 2022. And then in April of this year, we were authorized by the final regulatory agencies who decide on these things to build this memorial on the National Mall, 3 blocks from the U.S. Capitol, with a direct view of the Capitol Dome. This is so important at a time when journalists around the world are in such danger and the threats are rising everywhere. We believe it's essential to locate this memorial on the National Mall where it will be seen by millions of people. And to have this direct view of the US Capitol will vividly illustrate the connection between journalism and the symbols of democracy. We hope that visitors will appreciate the role of journalism as a pillar of democracy and the sacrifices that many journalists have made to do their jobs. Journalists, after all, are eyewitnesses to great events. They record and report on those events for posterity, and they hold the powerful accountable. Without journalists, citizens would not have the information they need to participate in our democracy. I want to tell you a little bit about the origins of the idea for the memorial. We certainly have heard today already about many journalists who've lost their lives in other countries around the world, and American journalists who've lost their lives covering international events. But we don't realize that journalists also lose their lives while doing their jobs here in the United States. And the greatest, most serious attack on American journalists occurred just 5 years ago, very near here in Annapolis, Maryland, in the newsroom of the Capital Gazette, which is one of the oldest newspapers in America. A gunman came into the newsroom there and killed 5 employees. Rob Hyacin, Gerald Fishman, John McNamara, Wendy Winters, and Rebecca Smith were all killed by this gunman. And that inspired former Congressman David Dreyer to think of how these journalists could be remembered. He had retired from Congress and was serving on the board of the Tribune Publishing, which publishes the Chicago Tribune and many other newspapers across the country, and which owned the Capital Gazette. And being a former congressman, he was well aware of the laws that that govern building of memorials. And he realized that there was no memorial anywhere in Washington to freedom of the press, to America's First Amendment, and that would commemorate the journalists who had lost their lives, often alongside the military people who were commemorated in the war memorials. So he formed the foundation and worked with former colleagues in Congress to pass the legislation authorizing our foundation to build the memorial. These 5 colleagues from the Capital Gazette and thousands of other journalists from the US and around the world will be honored by the memorial. The memorial itself will not have a list of names because the National Park Service has a rule to avoid the expense of having to add names, as we sadly would, to a memorial for journalists. And they also know that adding names would affect the integrity of the design. And so instead, this memorial's website will link to lists that have been compiled by the Freedom Forum, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and other organizations that have compiled lists of journalists who've lost their lives, and we will amplify these online by telling their stories. Now that we've secured the site, we're working on selecting a team to design and build the memorial, and we've invited more than 170 architects, designers, and artists to submit expressions of interest. 54 responded, and we've now narrowed that to a group of 12, and eventually we will narrow that even further until we make the final selection. Building a memorial in Washington is, as you might imagine, a highly regulated process. The Commemorative Works Act, which governs how memorials are approved and constructed, lists 24 steps between conceiving of the idea for a memorial and actually dedicating the memorial. Well, we're on step 13, so we have a ways to go. The memorial will be funded entirely from private money. No government funds will be used, and we think that's appropriate for the independence of the press. In fact, we have to raise not only 100% of the cost of construction, but another 10% for the National Park Service Maintenance Fund to cover the cost of maintaining the memorial after it is built. We have a goal of $50 million, which will cover the cost of building the physical memorial and creating a foundation endowment that will support the educational and programmatic activities that we want to engage in associated with the memorial. And so far, I'm very happy to tell you we have reached 44% towards our goal. Our ultimate goal is to dedicate the memorial in 2028 on the 10th anniversary of the assault on the Capitol Gazette. That's just 4.5 years from now. But by then, I look forward to welcoming you back to Washington to a memorial that will commemorate the fallen journalists of the world and educate and inspire the millions of visitors to Washington to appreciate the essential role of an independent press in fostering freedom throughout the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara, and best wishes on your plans. Let us turn to something a little bit different this time. Victor, you represent a foreign profit organization, an advertising agency called Pixel and Pixel based in Spain. But recently you've worked with UNESCO to design 3 global media campaigns, putting a spotlight on promoting media freedom and fighting impunity. Can you tell us how we can be more creative in representing complex problems like fighting impunity through media campaigns? And given today's media landscape dominated by digital forms, what platforms are most effective?
Hello, okay. First of all, me gustaría agradecer a la UNESCO que me haya dado esta oportunidad de estar aquí para poder compartir este panel con todos vosotros. Y dicho esto, bueno, la pregunta, efectivamente empezamos con el punto de que estamos hablando de algo que es complejo de comunicar. Cuando tenemos que hablar a la gente y queremos que capten nuestra atención, normalmente las agencias de publicidad disponemos de digamos, espacios muy cortos de tiempo, ¿no? Utilizamos anuncios que duran 30 segundos para intentar hacer algo muy eye-catching, que de alguna manera diga, hey, esto está pasando, pero el objetivo final creo que debería ser el de ser capaces de que la gente entienda el por qué esto está ocurriendo. Una vez que nosotros fuésemos capaces de que la gente entienda por qué se han asesinado a estos periodistas, cómo se encuentran sus familiares, qué trataban de mostrar al mundo, ¿no? Probablemente generaremos una conexión más emocional que simplemente quedarnos en una capa superficial de decir esto está ocurriendo, ¿vale? Una vez dicho esto, también es importante que entendamos que la gente a nivel comunicación recibe muchos impactos de manera diaria. En su feed de Instagram o en redes sociales vamos a tener que competir con ofertas de trabajo, influencers dando consejos de belleza, y todo esto es el tipo de información que muchas veces es la realidad. Nosotros tenemos que competir para mostrar nuestro mensaje. Dicho esto, sí que es cierto que el problema tiene una serie de particularidades que lo hacen, digamos, más fácil de generar atención que a lo mejor otros problemas que ocurren en el mundo. El primero es que el media, los periodistas, son los principales, y los medios de comunicación son las principales víctimas de este problema. Y a la misma vez estamos hablando que ellos son los que tienen el poder y las herramientas para darle visibilidad a esto, con lo cual hay otros problemas que no tienen esa ventaja, ¿no? Y luego, segundo, es que sí que es cierto que en un mundo cada vez más polarizado, con más puntos de vista, donde cuando uno consulta las noticias encuentra que sobre un mismo tópico hay diferentes approach, diferentes puntos de vista. Aquí lo que sí que es cierto es que nos encontraríamos con un panorama donde todos los medios de comunicación hablarían un mismo idioma y lo presentarían de manera muy homogénea, con lo cual todo el mundo tiene un punto de credibilidad y de importancia cuando ves que todos los medios del mundo hablan el mismo idioma y el mismo tópico y lo abordan de la misma manera. Creo que sería un panorama muy interesante a la hora de recibir la información como usuario. Entonces, dicho esto, Y una vez que identificamos cuál es el panorama en el que nos encontramos y quiénes son los players que de alguna manera pueden ayudarnos a dar visibilidad, creo que ya lo importante desde un punto de vista creativo y de comunicación es cómo lo vamos a comunicar, ¿no? En este caso, desde la agencia, hablando y pensando un poco internamente, pensamos que una de las formas más ideales de comunicar este problema sería el uso del branded content. El branded content entendido como esos documentales que vemos, por ejemplo, como Inside Job o una serie de episodios como puede ser White Helmet, donde de alguna manera sí disponemos del tiempo necesario para poder profundizar en el problema y explicarlo de una manera que de alguna manera enganche con las audiencias a las que vamos, ¿no? Además, estamos hablando de hacer producciones que tengan esa calidad que nos encontramos no solo a nivel visual, sino también de rigor científico, en cuanto a datos, en cuanto a los hechos que han movido. Hemos visto un vídeo hace 5 minutos al principio de la conferencia. Bueno, ese tipo de información trabajada de una manera profesional y luego apalancada en plataformas de streaming como puede ser un Netflix o un Amazon o un HBO, probablemente nos ayudarían a darle una visibilidad y un recorrido que actualmente las campañas en las que trabajamos no tienen, ¿no? O no llegan a ese alcance. Finalmente, pues el uso de los medios sociales, lógicamente, es muy importante. Actualmente, bueno, el 63 o el 65% de la población mundial tiene acceso a redes sociales y sí que es importante que tanto la UNESCO como los propios medios disponen de embajadores, celebrities y periodistas que con una capacidad de influencia muy grande, que trabajando todos al unísono podrían generar un nivel de visibilidad acerca de estos documentales o de estas series que comentaba y dirigir tráfico para que la gente finalmente terminase consumiéndolo. O sea, como anécdota os podría decir que ayer estuve en la biblioteca Jefferson, bueno, y estaba viendo una exhibición, ¿no? Con fotografías. Las fotografías eran impresionantes, tenías unos textos para leer y entender. Pero lo que realmente me conmovió fue cuando tuve la oportunidad de coger asiento y ver un vídeo, ¿no? Un vídeo que me explicaba el porqué de esas fotos, la importancia de esa documentación, el trabajo que había detrás. Cuando tuve la oportunidad de profundizar fue cuando entendí la importancia que tiene bueno, pues el trabajo probablemente de todos esos periodistas. Hablaban de la depresión, hablaban de tópicos muy importantes y creo que es lo que probablemente nos falta para terminar de conectar de una manera emocional con el mass media, con la gente de a pie. Creo que todos los que estamos aquí somos conscientes del problema, pero para generar atención, para que la gente realmente quiera prestar e involucrarse, hablamos de la gente de la calle, una solución como la que os acabo de plantear sería una estrategia que a lo mejor podría funcionar bien.
Thank you, Victor, for your perspective on fighting impunity. Soleil, you are part of an African network on investigative reporters and editors, and recently you've been working on investigative projects that include providing new angles into the investigations of killed journalists. Tell us about your most recent project and how investigative journalism can complement other efforts, such as prosecutions, in solving complex murder of journalists.
Thank you very much. Let me start by expressing gratitude to UNESCO, the Organization of American States, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights for inviting the network of African investigative reporters and editors to this very important tribune. We've been working on different investigative journalist projects, including investigation of killed journalists, cross-border, transnational investigative stories. And the last case of investigation of killed journalists we worked on was the Martinez Zogo case. Early this year, in January, the Cameroonian journalist Martinez Zogo, who was also the director of the Cameroonian radio station. Amplitude FM was found dead on the outskirts of Yaoundé, which is the capital city of Cameroon. So his body reportedly showed signs of torture. His foot was broken, his tongue deformed, and his fingers had been cut off. So Martinez Zogo was murdered. He was investigating a huge corruption cases involving the elites, the ruling elite in Cameroon. So obviously the Network of African Investigative Reporter was among those who questioned the official narrative of the killing of Martinez Zogo. And we decided to launch our own Arizona project to dig deeper and deeper. So why the Arizona project? It's important to recall that in 1976, Don Bowles, a reporter of the Arizona Republic, was investigating the local mob when he was killed in a car bombing. And in response, dozens of reporters from across the US poured into the state to investigate his murder and continue his work under the direction of the recently formed media collective Investigative Reporters and Editor, also known as IRE. So the following years, they published a major story on organized crime, and their work came to be known as Arizona Project. So we too, at the Network of African Investigative Reporter, decided to launch our own Arizona Project for the Martinez Zogo cases. And the thing is the death of journalists is more rampant in Africa than anywhere else. So we said to ourselves, when some of our colleagues across Africa did something that is good, and then they were killed, when they do a formidable work and then they are killed, murdered, why not to take it upon ourselves to do the work and continue it? So this is some of the reason that led us to start an investigation for the case of Martinez Zogo in Cameroon. So despite the very challenges we were confronted with, we finally were able to put together a very detailed story that obviously was diametrically opposed to the official narrative of the killing of Martinez Zogo. And the story was a detailed story that actually complicated the official narrative of Martinez Zogo killing. Martinez Zogo was had actually been sacked into what we may call a Shakespearean presidential succession drama, so involving at least 3 warring factions, and one using this killing, this murder, to destroy different factions. So we wanted, with our own Arizona project, to amplify the message about press freedom, that killing a journalist does not kill the story. So the project at least succeeded in putting the Martinez Zogo cases on the map. Before an international audience, newspapers like The Guardian published a story, as did many other international newspapers, and across Africa. The story was front page in many countries. Why the international media outlets? This part is quite important because in Cameroon, the same applies to many African countries. We are in a situation where those in power are more interested in what is reported in international media than in domestic ones. So obviously, we could replicate the Martinez Zogo case. We could replicate the Arizona project that we did with the Martinez Zogo case all over Africa, where many, let's say, journalists are killed and the murder go unnoticed because in most of the cases they are unreported. But we are very limited. We have very limited capacities, and what we need is support. And on this, I would like to thank again the Organization for American States, UNESCO, American Commission for Human Rights. So we are actually committed journalists. NER have been founded by 19 journalists from 14 African countries with the support of ZAM, Z-A-M, which is a media platform based in the Netherlands committed to support African journalists. We are willing to do more, so what we need is support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Soleil, for your courageous work. Last but not least, Jeanette is an investigative journalist. You've been abducted more than once and faced life-threatening situations. You have soldiered on and won international awards for your extraordinary courage in the face of danger. Some of your colleagues have not been able to make it, and you plan to build a memorial for them. Tell us, what is the significance of courage in the pursuit of justice, and what are its limits?
¿Sí?
Ok.
Bueno. Voy a hablar en español, pero antes quiero mostrarles 3 rostros, porque hay muchas formas de morir. A muchos colegas los han matado físicamente, pero también muchos quedamos muertos en vida. A ellas 3 esperamos verlas libres muy pronto. El gobierno iraní las tiene detenidas. Una de ellas acaba de ser galardonada con el Premio Nobel de Paz. Están en difíciles situaciones de reclusión y por su condición de mujer, aún más, las esperamos en libertad pronto. Y yo no soy publicista, no tengo una gran organización, soy sobreviviente. Ejerciendo mi labor me secuestraron, me torturaron y me violaron masivamente, me mataron en vida y eso tuve que tomarlo para poder seguir con mi trabajo de periodista. Empecé un camino de justicia muy difícil, porque tal vez eso es lo más complicado de quedar vivo, buscar justicia. Y qué bueno recordarlo hoy, 2 de noviembre, cuando el 90% de los casos de periodistas está en la impunidad. Y con el apoyo en Colombia de la Fundación para la Libertad de Prensa, decidí empezar a caminar todo ese trayecto de reivindicación. Llevamos mi caso hasta la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos y hace exactamente 2 años la Corte Interamericana condenó al Estado colombiano, a mi país, por lo que me ocurrió ese nefasto 25 de mayo del 2000. Cuando las abogadas me dijeron que qué iba a pedir de reparación, qué era lo que le iba a exigir a la Corte, lo primero que les dije es que quería que cerraran la cárcel donde me secuestraron y que se convirtiera en un gran lugar de memoria. Que todos esos 5,000 reclusos que estaban allí fueran ubicados en otro lado y allí pudiéramos hacer memoria sobre lo que había ocurrido. No logré que cerraran la cárcel, pero en cambio la Corte Interamericana aceptó y le ordenó al Estado colombiano crear un centro de memoria e investigación para las mujeres víctimas y sobrevivientes de violencia sexual como yo, pero también para las y los periodistas. Y creo que al final eso, el poder tener algo tangible, donde se hable de la investigación, donde se reivindique la memoria de quienes han sido afectados, es el mejor legado. Porque hoy yo estoy aquí en Washington en una situación compleja porque sigo amenazada, sigo ejerciendo el periodismo en un carro blindado y con muchos escoltas, y sé que en cualquier momento me van a matar. Y lo más importante es que eso físico, tangible, que podamos hacer por esas otras mujeres y esos otros hombres que en cualquier rincón del mundo están afrontando lo mismo que yo estoy afrontando, es lo más importante que podemos hacer no solo por la memoria, sino por la historia del periodismo en el mundo. Porque lamentablemente nos convertimos en cifras. Hoy estamos hablando de 37 periodistas asesinados y asesinadas en la Franja de Gaza, y son números nada más. Mientras estamos aquí en este salón, ellos y ellas están allá esperando a que les caiga la bomba. Y en México, muchos de nuestros colegas están escribiendo esperando a que el narcotráfico les pegue un disparo. Y en toda América Latina tenemos a cientos y cientos de periodistas que se han autocensurado porque el poder corrupto de los gobernantes les silencia. Así que tener un lugar donde estemos recordando constantemente el valor de esas personas es lo mejor que le podemos entregar, no solamente a un grupo, sino al mundo, porque quienes comunican son el cordón umbilical entre las comunidades y la realidad del mundo, y eso se nos olvida. Y hoy es importante recordarlo, porque sin esos periodistas sería imposible poder ayudar a la transformación de tantas comunidades. Por eso es necesario hacer memoria, por eso es importante un monumento donde estén esos nombres, por eso es súper clave desde los medios de comunicación, desde nuestros medios de comunicación, recordar que la gente hoy puede hablarse y puede conocer lo que pasa en el planeta gracias a esos hombres y a esas mujeres. Y es allí donde está parte de la responsabilidad de tener estos lugares de memoria y de reconocimiento, de hacer parte de la construcción de esa historia. Y yo cierro con algo que para mí hoy es muy importante. Primero, haberme reencontrado con mi amigo Luis Botello, quien hoy es nuestro presentador oficial en este día de conmemoración, porque él hace 23 años fue el primer periodista que me entrevistó tras mi secuestro. Fue al primer periodista que le conté mi historia. Y yo estaba en el borde de irme al exilio. Y en una esquina del Central Park en Nueva York, le dije con mucho miedo que yo renunciaba al exilio porque volvía a Colombia, porque prefería morirme allí en Colombia con un disparo y no de la tristeza en un cuarto en Alemania, en Berlín, a donde me habían enviado al exilio. Así que también es bueno hoy hacer esa reivindicación. Y mi segunda reivindicación hoy es que yo tuve el honor de recibir el Premio Mundial de Libertad de Prensa de la UNESCO, a quien agradezco por ser mi familia, en el año 2000, en plena pandemia. Y recibí mi premio a través de Zoom, a través de la pantalla del computador. Luego, a los 2 años, intentamos nuevamente que me entregaran el premio en Uruguay y me dio COVID y no pude. Y hoy mi amigo Guillermo Canela de UNESCO, por fin me ha entregado mi premio. Hoy lo he recibido. Así que creo que estos actos, estos pequeños, grandes actos, también hacen parte de la reivindicación, porque un simple diploma a mí me recuerda que tengo una responsabilidad muy grande con mis colegas hombres y mujeres periodistas. Tuve la fortuna de quedar viva y por ellos y por ellas tengo que seguir haciendo mi trabajo. Gracias.
Thank you, Janeth. Thank you so much. We started a little bit late, but I'm hoping we still have time for one or two questions from the audience. Well, then let me turn to you all and ask you in 1 or 2 minutes each, just to reflect on what your co-panelists said up here or what you've heard earlier in the day. And why don't we'll go just right down the line with the microphone being handed one to the other since we've had some issues.
Thank you very much. I think preserving the memory of killed journalists is a very important step in strengthening all these organizations that committed to preserve the freedom of speech, which is, again, which is one of the most important pillars of our democracy. The previous speaker were here, they said it before, and my co-panelists as well insisted on the fact that journalists are pivotal tools to strengthening democracy, especially in our countries in Africa and in many places where we are still struggling to get the voices of grassroots level organizations and ordinary citizens, and especially to hold accountable those into power. So again, I would like to thank the organizer of this important forum for getting us all here to have our voice and express the different, let's say, needs of our organizations. I think we need to come together, strengthening partnership, coordination in strategizing all, let's say, the mechanism in protecting the journalists so as to give a chance to freedom of expression and democracy all over the world. Thank you.
Being with these panelists has brought back some great memories. I was an editor on the Arizona project back in the day, so and right now the same thing is going on with the after the killing in Nevada of Jeff German, the investigative reporter at the at Las Vegas Review-Journal, who was doing some investigations, and his colleagues have picked up the mantle and are continuing that. And that's such an important important point. And I had the pleasure of meeting our last speaker at the International Women's Media Foundation event, where she received a Courage in Journalism Award from that organization. And so many times we have heard that having that international recognition is something that makes a great deal of difference to those who are in jail or under threat, that international recognition is so important. I guess the one final thought I would leave you with is that when we were talking about building the memorial, we got some pushback from some of our colleagues here in the US who said, look, there's a crisis in local journalism, there's a crisis in investigative journalism. Why are you asking for resources to put into putting, you know, another statue on in Washington? And I think the answer to that is very clear, that we will never be able to bring back readership, we will never be able to connect with the public unless we can establish the hero status of journalists to the larger public. And that's exactly what this memorial will do. Journalists will take their place as heroes alongside the other heroes of our history, and the soldiers who fought and died, and the leaders who carried us through great crises in our history, and other historic events that are marked in Washington. And so I think that's the most important thing. Unless we can reaffirm and establish that hero status for journalists, the success of media enterprises is going to be very fragile. So that's why we need to have all these ways of connecting with the public.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very moved with what was said just now, and I think that really underlines the importance of people, journalists, telling these stories themselves, and how we need to keep doing that, giving a platform to that. I would say, in addition to commemorating, which is very important, I think also keep talking about how we can improve, how we can engage, how we can talk to the people that can actually change the situation, that can be instrumental in improving the environment for journalists and for people to be informed, is very crucial as well. Thank you.
Yo resaltaría algo importante de lo que ha ocurrido hasta ahora en esta jornada. Primero, que sigue siendo muy valioso que nos encontremos, que nos escuchemos, porque yo vivo en mi realidad en América Latina, pero mis colegas en África también están viviendo su realidad, y es igual de difícil, y es igual de complicada, y tiene mucho peso encima. Y cuando llegamos a estos espacios y compartimos de alguna manera no solo el dolor, sino el valor, la resiliencia, esa palabra tan hermosa, resiliencia, creo que eso nos recarga para regresar a seguir haciendo nuestro trabajo. Pero sí quiero hacer mucho énfasis en algo que seguimos insistiendo desde UNESCO y desde las Naciones Unidas, y es que la violencia en línea se está convirtiendo en una de las peores herramientas para censurarnos, y para las mujeres es aún más difícil. La violencia en línea ejercida contra las mujeres que comunican es uno de los peores crímenes que tenemos hoy en el mundo, y que necesita nuestra atención, que necesita que pongamos nuestra mirada allí. Y quiero dejarlo como una reflexión, pero también como un llamado, aún más en este recinto de la Organización de Estados Americanos, para que tomemos acción conjuntamente y podamos enfrentar esa nueva terrible amenaza que tenemos. Y gracias por la voz de cada uno de ustedes.
Bueno, yo por mi parte, de igual manera, tu relato ha sido muy conmovedor, y precisamente lo que pretendía comentar con la charla del principio es que esto no debería quedar en un espacio, en mi opinión, tan reducido como es este. Realmente el objetivo de empresas como la nuestra se trata de que esto trascienda, entendiendo que los códigos para que la gente lo interprete bien, lo consuma, están cambiando, especialmente en los entornos digitales, y el objetivo final sería que todo esto tenga la visibilidad que se merece, bien representada en un memorial, pero también dándole de verdad todo el discurso que hay detrás, entender por qué está pasando esto, por qué es importante que la gente defienda y se involucre con esta causa, porque efectivamente estamos hablando de la defensa de la democracia, de informar de lo que está pasando, ¿no? Entonces, creo que es muy importante que la gente de a pie sea consciente, y ahí es donde está la labor y el reto de rivalizar con muchos otros problemas que también tenemos y ver cómo le damos visibilidad a esto. En cualquier caso, es increíble el relato.
Thank you so much. One key message that came across to me in all the presentations was just the importance of visibility. Whether it's through symbolic acts, memorials, media representations, investigative journalism, or demonstrating courage to keep a memory alive, we must not let impunity disappear into oblivion. Those who kill journalists do so with the purpose of silencing them in order to protect their interests. Making impunity visible is a strategy of thwarting their objective. Another thing that came over to me was whether we're in the media ourselves or are fighting on behalf of media freedoms, is that we're all in this together, and we have to be able to rely on each other and support one another. Please join me in thanking Janeth, Sile, Victor, Barbara, and Evelyn for sharing with us their organization's approaches in making impunity visible. Thank you to all of you for participating in this session, and I now turn it back over to Luis Spataro.
Everybody, thank you everybody. Now we have a break, 10 minutes. We can come back in 10 minutes. The break is going to be downstairs and have some coffee, water, something to eat. But thank you for the panel. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you in a while. Hey, Rodrigo, ¿cómo estás?
Bien, bien, hermano.
Bien, bien, ¿cómo has estado? Hi everybody, good afternoon. If everybody can start coming, we're going to start the next section. Yes, together. Yeah, I'll call Philip you first, and then together. Okay. All right. I'll let for the next session about lining multi-stakeholders talk, the future of the media and safety of journalists. I'm going to say just before I get into that, quería decir unas palabras en español porque las cosas que están pasando en América Latina en los últimos días son bastante graves para el periodismo, desde México hasta Chile, especialmente en Centroamérica, donde tenemos unas crisis políticas en cada uno de los países, incluyendo el país que me vio nacer, Panamá, en donde en las últimas 2 semanas han habido protestas donde hay una gran cantidad de agresión contra periodistas, contra la sociedad civil, que muy descontenta con sus líderes. Yo creo que es importante utilizar estos escenarios para recordar la importancia que tienen los periodistas, la libertad de expresión sobre todo, y lo importante que es la sociedad civil en estos momentos, en donde los periodistas dependen de fuentes abiertas, dependen de que la sociedad civil también entienda el rol que tienen, y en estos momentos donde, en el caso de Panamá, donde hay unas protestas que se han tornado violentas, más de 500 detenidos, incluso un fotógrafo que perdió un ojo en estas protestas y en la represión que se está dando. Yo creo que es importante llamar la atención de las autoridades de que el periodista, la sociedad civil que se manifiesta a través de las redes sociales es necesaria y cumple un rol de contrapeso, especialmente en países donde existe un alto nivel de corrupción y en donde existe una crisis política. Con esas palabras quiero dar paso al próximo panel, our next panel, who is going to be moderated by Jan Phillips, who is the Director of News and Media Division of the United Nations Secretariat. Philip, thank you for coming and for hosting this session.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and we're going to get straight onto it with the panel coming on stage. We're not going to go one by one, we're just going to speed up. Wherever you wish. Got a space in the middle. No, that's it. Want to come over? Don't we have sway? Come up from the audience. Yes. So, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ian Phillips, and I am Director of the News and Media Division at the United Nations Department of Global Communications. It's a great pleasure to moderate this panel today. We owe so much to frontline journalists who risk everything to do their job, especially now at a time of rampant mis- and disinformation. The meaning of the front lines has changed dramatically in recent years. Of course, it refers to war and conflict, but it also applies increasingly to simply reporting the facts during turbulent elections, the COVID-19 pandemic, and exposing corruption and holding officials accountable. Being a journalist can be the best job in the world, and it can also be one of the deadliest. The threats are continually evolving for journalists in the field, in newsrooms, or even working from what they think is the safety of their living room. The threats are multiple, including imprisonment, legal harassment, arbitrary detention, surveillance, and online and offline harassment, especially against women journalists. There's even the risk of identity theft, with bad actors online and in social media impersonating you and spreading lies in your name. During my career in journalism, I witnessed firsthand how my colleagues were increasingly targeted in this never-ending cycle of violence and repression. Some bravely continued, while others decided their time in the field was over. In times of crisis, it was frustrating to see that there was no clear process at a global level to truly deal with the threat. We're going to explore these important themes today and consider what journalism might look like in the future if the world fails to halt the wave of impunity that protects those who attack journalists. Before launching our discussion, I would like to give the floor to a journalist who bravely works to bring verified information to the public in the context of incredibly tough conditions and personal risks. So please welcome Mr. Sway Win to the stage. Mr. Win is the chief correspondent and editor-in-chief of Myanmar Now, an organization now based in Australia. And during his career, he has been the subject of death threats, assault, arrests, legal charges, exile, and other targeted attacks in attempt to silence his work.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for continuing to stay in our session. So, my name is Sway Win. I'm a 45-year-old journalist from the country of Myanmar, which is also called Burma. So, very few people know where our country is. It's located, there is only one country right between India and China. It's called Burma or Myanmar. It's north of Thailand, a country of about 55 million people. In terms of size, it's the biggest country in Southeast Asia and larger than France and Germany combined. So our country had long been an authoritarian state since even before I was born. Since 1948, we gained independence from the British, but we enjoy a relative peace and a limited democracy within the 10 years between 2010 and 2020. But after the military takeover in 2021, our country is now back under the military rule. I grew up as a young man with democratic aspirations, and then I spent about 7 years in prison as a political dissident, as a student activist from 1998 to 2005. And then after I got released from jail, I plunged into journalism, which I found is very useful actually to bring justice for the society. So after the military takeover in 2021, our country has become a country very much like North Korea. We are in the midst of the civil war. We have daily area bombardment with the military using 21st century Russian jet fighters almost every day. Independent media has also been attacked since the coup. The newly installed military regime has moved swiftly to silence media outlets. As a result, our country currently ranks 173rd out of 180 countries in the world for press freedom, according to Reporters for Without Borders. Journalists and media organizations cannot operate freely inside the country, as publication and broadcast licenses have been revoked, and editors and reporters have been arrested and tortured, including a colleague of mine who continued to work as an underground photographer. He was recently arrested during a secret assignment to cover the aftermath of a cyclone. He was arrested and sentenced to 21 years in jail on charges of causing defamation to the military. So the challenge, the situation is very, very tough. You cannot even go out with any kind of camera. There are checkpoints on many streets, and the military will check your mobile phone. If they see you sharing a Facebook post which might be deemed defamatory to the region, you can get immediately arrested and jailed. So that's the state of our country. And also our country has become one of the, I would say actually, one of the partners of Russia over the past few years. So the situation is very tough. I myself am facing terrorism charges in my home country, and my house was confiscated as well, and all my family members were homeless actually. They were also forced to flee, but it's nothing uncommon. That's not unique at all actually, you know. That's a daily occurrence facing many people, journalists and activists in my country. So after the military takeover, we are forced into exile in the neighboring countries, but the biggest problem has become the financial viability for us actually, because we depended on the readers inside the country, on the local businesses inside the country. But after we were outlawed, all our financial assets were frozen, all our bank accounts were frozen, and also our readers actually can no longer support us because many of them do not have the foreign currency bank accounts, etc. So just to conclude actually, you know, there are so many challenges, but I want to point out one challenge actually, you know. So this is wartime journalism. In the wartime journalism, the journalists have no legal burden. That creates a lot of problem. And also the social media. Social media inherently actually is lawless. So that also creates a lot of problems actually, you know. So, but we are trying to comply with the universal journalism principles actually, you know, whether you work in Israel or Palestine or, you know, in Ukraine, everybody has to pay a price, you know, for any kind of reckless wrongdoing actually, you know. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wynne, for that very personal and poignant testimony, and it sets us up nicely for this discussion. And I would like to, first of all, welcome this great panel to today's proceedings. To my left, and going from my left, we have Dr. Julie Posetti, VP of Research at the International Center for Journalists. We have Stuti Kamani, Senior Economist at the World Bank. And to her left, Jeff Marder, Executive Director, Human Rights and Indigenous Policy at Global Affairs Canada. Laxman Dutt Pant, Chairperson, Media Action Nepal, and Co-Chair of the Media Freedom Coalition Consultative Network. And to my far left, we have Andy Heslop, Executive Director, Press Freedom at the World Association of News Publishers, WANIFRA. So this is a flash talk format, and we'd like to keep this session as interactive as possible. We also invite observations from the audience. I'll ask my panelists to be short and concise. We've probably got about 3 minutes each, so that we can then get to questions, hopefully, from the floor. I'll start with you, Andy, at the far left. We have started off by describing journalism as a really tough job, and it's getting tougher. As we contemplate the future of the media and impunity against journalists, why would anyone get into journalism? And what are you seeing in terms of morale in newsrooms or career longevity?
Well, that was a good start. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. The curse of the final panel before the end of the day were the only things between you guys and a reception event, so we bear that in mind, and we'll keep things moving along at a tickety spate. So, why would anyone go into journalism right now? I think that's a fundamental question. The threats that we've seen outlined in detail today are really the crux of it, but I think in many respects also the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the realities of what it is to work in today's newsrooms. I think certainly we're an organization that represents 18,000 publications in around 120 countries across the world. And big or small, well-resourced or right down to community level news organizations, you know, they're all struggling at the moment. The pressures to just report the news are as extreme as I think they ever have been, and certainly in my lifetime of doing this job. And it's really and we've touched on it, and previous interventions have touched on it, but I think it's really important to emphasize this psychological aspect of the support that we give to our colleagues who are working in the newsrooms on stories that are intense, that are multidimensional, that are incredibly complex, yet the pressure to get them right has never been so intense. And the justification or the accountability that lies behind all of that is not just daily, but it's by the minute. And that is a level of pressure that I think we haven't quite begun to understand. Certainly one of the many sort of global trends that we've observed, and again, this goes for large organizations, well-resourced, global organizations, right the way down the chain, is obviously the financial repercussions of certainly the last few years since the pandemic. But as we all know, the dire situation for media began long before that, and we're living through those hard times. Every news organization is struggling financially in some capacity, some more than others, of course, but the knock-on effects for safety are mind-blowing in terms of so many different facets. But one that I would highlight before we move on is this, and it's across the board again, this sort of period of retrenchment where we're seeing so many colleagues, experienced colleagues, those who've gone through elections, given the topic of today's discussions, who've gone through very hard times in the past, who are no longer in those newsrooms, who are no longer leading those newsrooms, who are no longer in positions to influence the culture of safety within the news organizations that they work for. And in many cases are being replaced by new colleagues, which is always good. You know, new blood and new life in newsrooms is essential. But the danger is, given the financial restrictions, given the pressures, given everything that's, you know, convening on new young journalists in newsrooms around the world, is that they lack the experience, they lack the knowledge in many cases, they're not trained, they're being given assignments, often multiple assignments, they're often fulfilling multiple roles within newsrooms because, hey, you know, who knew it, but young people can do everything, so therefore they're literally given everything to do. And that's incredibly dangerous because they don't have the skills that are required to be able to cover the incredibly difficult stories that we're asking them to cover. The management is not there in many respects because of the pressures and being pulled left, right, and center on everything to provide the kind of institutional support that is needed and the duty of care that is required to guide those young colleagues through it. And I think that's a red flag moment for any news organization. Simply the pressures are intense. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. No, I think that's really accurate, and from my own experience, really resonates. I think that is, you've summed up very nicely how newsrooms really are struggling, and hopefully will prosper nonetheless. On to you, Julie. You've done some very important work looking at violence against women, and I believe you've launched a new study just today. So please tell us a little about that, and also about big data analysis and how that has aided your work.
Sure. So I think the work that you're alluding to was the original part of that work was commissioned by UNESCO, actually. We published a year ago today, a big study called The Chilling, which was about online violence towards female journalists. And one of the points we made in that book was that impunity for online violence aids and abets impunity for crimes against journalists. And some key statistics that you've probably heard now for the past couple of years, but are worth repeating, when we think about the function of online violence and its potential to escalate into offline harm. So 73% of the women journalists we surveyed for that study said they had experienced online violence in the course of their work. And 20% of the women who responded said that they had experienced offline attacks, abuse, and harassment that they believed had been seeded online. So this propensity for escalation and this trajectory becomes a really important point for consideration with regards to responses and policies and legislative reactions to this crisis. And it is a crisis, and it feeds into what Andy was saying and the point of your question to him, which is that this phenomenon is not just chilling investigative journalism practiced by women, but it is also forcing women out of the profession. And I teach journalism at City University. I'm a professor there as well. And I gave a lecture about this theme just 2 weeks ago, and several of the students came up to me afterwards and said, you know, we're terrified of saying anything in public because of what we've seen happening to women journalists around the world. So this is a really serious issue. The propensity for psychological harm is also massive. So that's just to put it in context. It's really important to monitor effectively to prevent escalation. So how do you monitor violations against, let's say, female journalists online? And I'm talking specifically about female journalists because of their much greater exposure to risk. But as you suggested, we have launched today a brand new report. It's called a Big Data Case Study, looking at online violence against Carmen Aristegui, who is a very prominent journalist in the Americas. She's a Mexican investigative journalist who founded Aristegui Noticias, and she has been targeted for, according to our timeline, about 15 years, but with points of escalation in the abuse that she experiences, which includes death threats, rape threats, threats to her son. When he was a teenager, he was subjected to surveillance. Pegasus spyware was involved. She has even been assassinated online. And by that I mean she was the subject of orchestrated disinformation campaigns, highly gendered ones, one of which involved a mock report of her assassination. So disinformation being used as a tactic against particularly female journalists. That case is extremely disturbing. We also see in Carmen's case the weaponization of impunity cases against journalists. So she is threatened with reference to journalists who have been murdered in Mexico. Mexico is, as many of you will of course be aware, the deadliest place in the world to practice journalism outside of a war zone, and has been for many years. And not only that, there's a 98% impunity rate. So you factor that in alongside the extraordinary rate of femicides in the country, and you have an incredibly toxic situation, and online violence has not necessarily been seen as a primary threat because the physical violence is so overwhelming in that country. But we've been able to establish through an analysis of these 2 million plus tweets in Carmen Aristegui's case, that this situation is one of obvious escalation, and there are warning signs that need to be reacted to. Now, one of our recommendations in the UNESCO study, The Chilling, one of the recommendations we made was that there needs to be a response to this crisis that sees collaboration between intergovernmental organizations, civil society, the UN special mechanisms, news organizations, for example, to develop what we called an online violence early warning system, so that this concept of preventing and protecting and then prosecuting crimes against journalists could include the function of monitoring in a way that if we can access the data, we can see where these points of escalation are, and we can hopefully intervene. And so the study on Carmen that we've published today is one of about 8 that we are producing for a project that the UK Foreign Office has invested in to try to see if we can in fact develop this online violence early warning system. And through that work, we have published 15 indicators for online violence escalation, along with monitoring guidance, which also sees us mapping online violations against female journalists to the various international codes, including the criminal codes that can be applied. So it's a very practical way to address the problem, and that's this book, which you can see on stage, and which I have here, and there have been copies floating around, published by the OSCE just a couple of weeks ago, which pulls together a lot of this research, but tries to provide a practical framework to respond to that research.
Thank you for that important work, Julie. And I would add that I've had female journalists in recent years say, I don't want a byline. And that's such a sad moment when they say, I don't want to be associated with my work because of the risk of people coming after me. So,
making us invisible, which is the aim.
Exactly. I'd like to turn to Jeffrey. Canada has been at the forefront of some very interesting and pioneering work, in my opinion, towards journalist safety, particularly in the area of online harassment. Tell us a little about that and your work in this field.
Hello?
Yeah, perfect.
I just want to start by saying it is a pleasure to be able to continue the collaboration between Canada and UNESCO on media freedom issues, and it's also personally a great pleasure to be back again at the Organization of American States. I think this event and the words of pretty much all the participants today have spoken to the importance of collective action. And what I would like to speak to, take this opportunity to speak a little bit about an initiative, a collective initiative that is still relatively young but maturing quickly, namely the Media Freedom Coalition, which was referred to this morning by the Dutch ambassador, the Dutch being one of the current co-chairs of the coalition. Now the coalition was established almost 5 years ago. And it was established as a multi-stakeholder coalition. It comprises member states, and we have 50 member states at the moment, so it's grown quite impressively. All member states have to take a pledge and commit themselves to working together to improve media freedom, both in their own countries, but also collaborating internationally. We also have a civil society consultative network. A number of the civil society organizations that are participating today and tomorrow are members of the consultative network, and Laxman, who is one of the current co-chairs of the consultative network, will speak more to its work. But a couple things that they do is they make recommendations to the member states of the Media Freedom Coalition on cases of concern, places where we should take action, and in short, they really keep us on our toes and keep our feet to the fire to ensure accountability by member states on media freedom. Another key element or partner in the Media Freedom Coalition is a high-level panel of legal experts. It does a number of things. It is prepared to help states. One of the things that was referred to, and I see the special rapporteur, she referred this morning to the importance of political will. The high-level panel of legal experts is prepared to support states that have the political will for really anything that can help support media freedom in their countries, revising or creating a better legal framework for journalism in their countries. Another thing that the high-level panel does is they've done a number of thematic reports, and one of them speaks directly to the theme of this event. They have made a thematic report and a recommendation to create an international investigative body for crimes against journalists. And the Dutch, again, who are key partners in all of this, have taken it upon themselves to do a feasibility study on looking at how to implement this recommendation. Finally, UNESCO is also a key partner, and I would say principally in their management of the Global Media Defense Fund, which to date, I think they're up to supporting more than 120 projects, mostly of grassroots media organizations in every region of the globe. I said we're a young organization, so not quite 5, but we are maturing quickly. We have a secretariat that was operationalized just about a year ago, which allows the co-chairs and the executive group and the broader membership to focus on the strategic direction of the Media Freedom Coalition. Some of the things that we do is we issue statements, thematic statements. We issued a statement today. We also issue country-specific and case-specific statements. We focus on cases of concern, principally ones brought to us by the consultative network. And in the past year and a half, we put greater emphasis on energizing our diplomatic networks. As 50 member states, we have diplomatic missions around the globe, and this has allowed us to focus efforts and sort of tailor efforts to the specific cases and media freedom needs in countries around the world. Much of this work is quiet diplomacy, but I think it offers great opportunities for the future, in particular to focus on instances of impunity. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Laxman, I'd like to turn to you. You also work with the Media Freedom Coalition. Could you tell us a little more about collaboration between states? I mean, we tend to talk about individual cases in individual countries, but what sort of consensus and coalition is perhaps growing out there, and maybe you want to focus on Asia or anywhere else in the world?
Well, thank you. More has been told by Jeff on the work of Media Freedom Coalition, but I would like to bring into your attention how the issue of press freedom globally has been changed ever since we noticed COVID-19 and ahead of many elections that we have been discussing this morning as well in the previous panel, how authorities in particular have been show reluctance to the issues of safety of journalists, mainly addressing the issue of disinformation. The idea of disinformation has now been taken as the pretext to attack upon the integrity of free and independent press. So when we talk about preventing disinformation, we should not forget that there are chances for authorities to misuse the idea of disinformation, mainly bringing anti-disinformation laws, which we have seen in some part of the world, for example, in some countries in the Southeast Asia. This is very crucial, and the immediate impact of disinformation being used as a tool to use against critical voice is to the lives of, mainly it has relations to the gender representation. There is large amount of gender disinformation being circulated both online and offline, and mainly by the power centers. So we need to look into these developing narratives in the post-COVID-19 context, but also in the context of the global incidents taking place, for example, natural disasters, and also elections around. Impunity for crimes against journalists should end for two reasons: to promote safety of journalists and to hold account the perpetrators, I would like to say. The perpetrators, mostly the state members, the United Nations, or of the state members within the present Media Freedom Coalitions, and any other regional instruments. They should look into their responsibility of protecting journalists from any sort of crimes, mainly by operationalizing effective action-taking mechanisms. It was a great moment for all of us to mark the commemoration day to day, and also look back how it all started. It imagined of establishing mechanisms in the countries, the mechanisms that have been established in some of the countries, for example, in Nepal as well. I'm fortunate to have been looking after this project while working with the UNESCO in Kathmandu. These mechanisms are not actually working to address the issue of impunity, because very less actions have been taken. Also, MFC is doing quite well in terms of bringing the issue of media freedom to the public attention through issuance of the statements mainly, but also coordinating efforts among countries. But I think some visible actions should be seen at this moment. That means actions should be taken against the perpetrators, and that could be taken a joint initiative by member states within MFC, or by the regional institutions, for example, EU, or for example, we're sitting here at the office of the organization of the American states. So I think a collaborative effort is very important, but at the same time, authorities are engaged in coming up with the sort of laws that are very much detrimental to upholding press freedom. So there are some initiatives taken place. Having said that, for example, within MFC, diplomatic network established in some of the countries at this moment. They are trying their level best to collaborate with the local actors. But the reference and the landscape that the countries should look into is, again, we need to check it this, whether this is well suited with the local context or not. So a more collaborative approach is needed to engage local actors, for example, CSOs. And we have seen some part of the world, many part of the world, and that sounds very well in terms of the South and Southeast Asia, including Nepal, that many journalists have lost their jobs during the COVID, showing the issue of sustainability. And those having been fired include the so-called mainstream media outlets, the corporate media outlets. And I think we should also look into this issue in a more sustainable way to ensure that the professional safety of journalists around.
Thank you so much, Laxman. Now for a different perspective, we turn to Stuti Kamani of the World Bank. She has done some interesting research on transparency and citizen engagement in the context of sustainable development. And we're curious to see your insights, your views of how journalists and an independent media might enhance that work.
Thank you. I'm delighted and honored to be part of this group, this panel, and to be in your company today. As you can guess, I'm a highly unusual participant, so let me just quickly tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from. I am an economist in a research division in the bank, which is unique in multilateral organizations to have an in-house research division, which is like an academic economics department, where most of our work and mandate focuses on doing rigorous, credibly independent research for academic journal publications, and then provide policy advice to the operations side of the World Bank, and indeed policy dialogue and debate and engagement with practitioners, policymakers, civil society across the world. So in some sense, I feel a kinship with the group of media people that are here. So I was asked to lead a report a few years ago to take stock of what we know from economics research on the role of citizen engagement and transparency. And the outcome of that was this report, this book, which is called Making Politics Work for Development. And as you might imagine, it was a highly politically sensitive area for the World Bank, and it didn't receive a press release. So I'm sort of chuckling inside with pleasure that I'm finally able to share it with groups in the media. Now, let me share with you the broad story of why would an organization like the World Bank be interested in the role of media in development, apart from the intrinsic value that we've seen and heard from the remarkable testimonies and the words of my fellow panelists here. There is a way to think about the role of media from the instrumental perspective of economic development. And there is an economic case to be made in the, if I might phrase it thus, in the enlightened self-interest of the perpetrators who commit crimes against journalists. And the argument in this book and in the economics literature would run as follows. Economic development inescapably depends upon public policies devised by states and governments as representatives of states. The quality of these public policies, whether they are sound public policies that contribute to the general well-being of society and economic development, that depends upon political institutions. And political institutions in turn, their incentives, their culture, their various sources of motivation of behavior is fundamentally shaped by media, and in turn shapes media, which is the reason for this conference today. So let me share with you some examples of what we found when we did this stock-taking of economics research. First, let me give you the example of Peru, when in the 1990s, there was an authoritarian regime with an internal police mechanism of surveilling citizens and controlling people. And fascinatingly, the chief of that internal police, this might be common knowledge here, but for us economists it was a real revelation, kept detailed account of bribes paid to various institutions of checks and balances in the country. And two economists got hold of that bribery data, analyzed it, and found two things. One, that the monthly bribe price to journalists was orders of magnitude greater than the monthly bribe price to judges, showing the importance of media for political incentives. And finally, when that regime collapsed, it was in fact one television station that was credited with bringing down the collapse of that regime. Now, a second example comes from when does an authoritarian system begin to acknowledge the value of a free media? And this example comes from a theoretical economic unpacking of the example of glasnost in the erstwhile USSR, where the argument that these economists make is that the regime was unable to deliver public services at the grassroots, down to the level of far-flung local and provincial governments, and began to pursue in phases transparency and media empowerment, because media was a helpful source for the national regime to hold local authorities accountable for public service delivery. And this is a very interesting interpretation by these economists because subsequently in the next few decades, what we've seen and we document in this book is that across countries with very different national political systems, all the way from very controlled authoritarian states to very messy democracies, one thing is shared in common, which is growing political participation at the local government level and willingness of national regimes across this political spectrum to devolve resources and service delivery responsibilities down to the level of locally elected governments. And we have evidence from research. Brazil is one country in which the body of evidence has really grown, that local elections along with local media, together these two forces contribute to lower corruption and stronger political incentives for service delivery. And I just remembered that this is not just a case of the global south. In fact, there is a paper that we cover in this report from the United States, which finds that states in the history of the United States, corruption began to come down faster in those states where the state capital was located closer to a bigger city rather than out in the boonies in a little, and the mechanism for that was through media. So the more the state capital was located in an urban center, the more media had access to the functioning of governments and was able to report on it. And finally, let me end with just one other way of thinking about the role of media, which doesn't necessarily go through holding accountable those in power, but is really about all of us as society. because sadly, some of the violence against journalists may be perpetrated by fellow citizens who do not hold positions of official power, but have hateful ideologies. And the media can also play a role in shaping how society thinks about where it wants to go for the common public interest. And one small piece of evidence in this regard that my colleague Phil Kiefer, who's at the IDB, and I did in Benin, which is typical of an African country with having vibrant community radio networks on which public interest programming is broadcast, we found that in villages where people had greater access to community radio, people were more likely to demand health and education services from elected political leaders rather than vote buying or violence or ethnicity. And so that is just one piece of a very open agenda in economics research to understand the role of media in shaping how society expects certain types of public policies or actions from their leaders. So again, I'm delighted to share this with you. Please do find this report and take a look at it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Hang on, this one works. We know this one works.
Okay, microphones are struggling. So we now want to turn it to the audience. I'm mindful of time. The clock actually went red and now it's disappeared, so we're probably running really over time. But would like a question or an observation from the audience. There's a rumor going around that drinks will not be served unless somebody asks a question or makes an observation. Just throwing that out there. Thank you. Everybody says thank you.
Thank you. Julie, you made reference to the psychological impact, and Andrew, you spoke about, the reasons why you shouldn't enter the newsroom. But I wanted to know, are you doing more work around mental health, and is that being amplified in the research that you're undertaking? And another question that I have to the other panelists, thank you for the work that you're doing at the World Bank. In terms of the research capacity. Unfortunately, the World Bank has really scaled down its work around access to information and the capacity that it used to have in that sphere. And this is critically important, and I hope that that will be resuscitated because it's very, very important making the link with that and accountability. So that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thanks. Do you want me to start? Okay. Thanks, Zoe. So with regard to the mental health impacts of online violence, this is the #1 issue that the over 700 women we surveyed and many of the 180 we interviewed for that big piece of research, the Chilling, highlighted. It was the #1 concern. And it is important to highlight that this is not an issue that is really only experienced by people in countries that we already have significant concerns about in terms of an absence of press freedom or extreme rates of violent crimes against journalists. This is a global phenomenon, so it really does stretch from New York to Nairobi. And so one of the things that becomes important in reference to that research is to not just collect the data to help understand where escalation can occur to murder with impunity, which of course is, vitally important. But one of the indicators that we have identified in that book that the OSCE published is that pylons, so when you have a massive outpouring of hate or abuse or harassment targeting a journalist, this can cause serious psychological harm, including PTSD, which should be recognised as a form of offline harm. And I think we need to start focusing on policies in connection with that. The other thing that I want to highlight, and I'm glad you've given me the chance to do this, and we haven't mentioned this yet, is the function of political actors, including presidents and ministers in governments, in triggering online violence against female journalists. And we have been able to map that in the case of Carmen Aristegui. So we see evidence that when the current president singles her out, as he routinely does, for reasons associated with what your research has indicated, because the reason they want to bribe journalists in other countries to stop their journalism is the same reason that they target journalists online or they kill them with impunity. So when she's called out and critiqued for her high impact investigative journalism and that of her colleagues, along comes the troll army, and again we see evidence of orchestration. And in one case we saw an online violence spike in our data that lasted for a week after he did that. So we really need to emphasize that this is not just about the need for civil society to protect and the need for, what we haven't mentioned again, the platforms to take a responsible role as an institution, but also for states and in particular for individual political leaders to commit to avoiding this kind of inflammatory behaviour, which really does pose a significant risk. So I'll leave it there. And Andy, do you need a microphone?
Let's do a quick 30 seconds and then we'll move on.
Hello. Oh, excellent. Yeah, 30 seconds. In short answer, Zoe, yes, we do a lot more work, primarily on two levels. It became very fashionable or very sort of necessary, I guess, during COVID and post-COVID to provide a lot of mental health and wellness for overworked newsrooms and staff who'd really been through the ringer covering the pandemic, and that has continued beyond the lifespan of the pandemic with our newsroom partners. We work with about 300 newsrooms in about 25 to 30 countries at the moment, specifically on this. But then there's sort of, I think, another level when it comes to more deeper seated, more longer term approaches to psychological support to newsroom staff, and particularly the way that we approach it is we work to empower newsrooms to identify before things become an issue, to debrief after an assignment, to really sort of take on board the duty of care element of the job, which is so hard given the pressures to maintain, but to sort of really prioritize that front and center for the benefits of their newsrooms. There's a lot more. You're all looking thirsty, so I'm going to can it.
Thank you, Andy. So we'll now wrap up with two guests who are going to make some brief remarks. The microphone gone? Is this their way of telling us we've got to wrap up? Okay. I'd first like to welcome to the stage Neville Gertz, a permanent representative of Namibia to the UN. So Namibia is the country where the Windhoek Declaration and the Windhoek Plus 30 Declaration on Information as a Public Good originated, two key documents for the multilateral commitment to press freedom and freedom of expression. Ambassador, the Windhoek Plus 30 Declaration has been endorsed with unanimity by all of UNESCO's member states. How do you think it can contribute to the UN Summit for the Future next year?
Thank you very much. As you may see, I'm not Neville, but I'm his deputy. My name is Helena, and thank you for having me this afternoon. I think the Windhoek Plus 30 Declaration on Information as a Public Good makes very specific recommendations for governments, intergovernmental organizations, technology companies, the media, civil society, and academia to uphold media freedoms. Amongst others, it calls for governments to make commitments that create an enabling environment for freedom of expression and access to information, and also the transparency and accountability of internet companies to eliminate threats to freedom of expression. I think the Summit of the Future gives us an opportunity to not only strengthen collaboration and partnership, but to strengthen effective multilateralism. The specific track that deals with the integrity of public information on digital platforms, I think, is an important avenue through which the summit creates an opportunity to really bring into focus not only promoting effective multilateralism and global governance, but also supporting active citizenship. For Namibia, the press freedom is revered. It's enshrined in our constitution as a fundamental freedom, and we consider what was done through the Windhoek Declaration as a gift to the world. Namibia has sustained its position as the freest press in Africa. It has also made sure that no journalist has lost their life in the time that they have served over the last 33 years. No journalist has lost their lives, or media practitioner has been tortured or imprisoned or threatened in Namibia for doing their job. And this is in contrast to the 1,600 journalists who've lost their lives worldwide. And I think as on the multilateral platform, we have a responsibility to make sure that we push forward with UNESCO's decision to fast-track the implementation of the key recommendations of the 10th anniversary on the consultation process of the UN Plan of Action on Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity. I think we also need to make sure that our focus is not only on, that our focus is on responding effectively to the findings of the UN report, the monitoring report, which indicates that sadly no country is on course to achieve the SDGs by 2030. And I think just generally, from an African perspective, Namibia reaffirms its commitment to press freedom as guaranteed in our constitution, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, as well as the Plan of Action on Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity. I've summarized it a little bit because I'm mindful of the fact that we don't have as much time as we may originally have had.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, it's my great honor to invite to the stage. It's my honor to maybe invite to the stage Nicole Cardoch Ramos, Undersecretary at the General Secretariat of the Government of Chile, the 2024 host of the World Press Freedom Day, and she'll explain to us how preparations are going and what to expect.
Good afternoon to you all. I'm going to make my presentation in Spanish. Agradezco la invitación al Gobierno de Chile, a la UNESCO, de ser parte de este gran momento de conversación, de compartir desafíos comunes en torno al fortalecimiento al periodismo, a la prensa libre y también a las comunicaciones, especialmente viniendo de un país que durante este año 2023 ha conmemorado los 50 años del golpe de Estado, un momento donde como país fuimos víctimas y vimos cómo generaba espacios la dictadura y el régimen a propósito de censurar la libertad de prensa y también amenazar la vida de grandes periodistas valientes, testimonios que dieron cuenta de lo que significa en carne propia la lucha contra una verdad que quería imponer en ese entonces el régimen militar. Nosotros como país además vamos a estar demostrando y vamos a estar siendo expectantes de lo que va a suceder el próximo año en la conmemoración del Día Internacional de la Libertad de Prensa. Queremos poner como Gobierno de Chile nuestra capacidad de organización y convocatoria al servicio de la reflexión global de lo que será la libertad de prensa y el ejercicio del periodismo. Entre el 2 y el 4 de mayo del próximo año, la UNESCO, en conjunto con el Gobierno, seremos los anfitriones de la 31ª edición del Día Mundial de la Libertad de Prensa en Santiago +30. El próximo año, el año 2024, coincide con una importante efeméride sobre la promoción de la libertad de prensa y la defensa de los medios de comunicación. En 1994, justo años después de recuperar la democracia en nuestro país, se generó y se firmó en Santiago de Chile la Declaración de Santiago sobre el desarrollo de los medios de comunicación y la democracia en América Latina y el Caribe. 4 años después, decía, de la recuperación de la democracia, este hito marcó el inicio de un trabajo nacional e internacional en materia de libertad de expresión y ejercicio del periodismo. Además, significó avances en el desarrollo y reconocimiento de los medios de comunicación comunitarios, en independencia y pluralismo de los medios de comunicación en América Latina y el Caribe. El tema central de este encuentro internacional en Santiago de Chile estará dedicado a la importancia del periodismo y la libertad de expresión en las democracias del mundo, en función de uno de los problemas centrales el día de hoy, la actual crisis medioambiental y sus efectos a escala global. Nuestro propósito es destacar el importante rol que juega actualmente el periodismo, el acceso y la producción de información para garantizar y asegurar un futuro para todos y todas. ¿Cómo se relaciona finalmente la crisis medioambiental con los testimonios que hemos escuchado durante toda esta jornada y en particular durante este panel? Los periodistas que cubren temas medioambientales, así como otros temas de alta complejidad de escala global, se enfrentan a una gran variedad de amenazas por las características de sus reportajes. Se han reportado casos que incluyen la violencia física, la vigilancia, la imposición de controles oficiales, el uso pernicioso del aparato estatal y las influencias privadas, filtros y moderación de contenidos para restringir el acceso a la información, entre otros. El único objetivo de estas amenazas es impedir que las audiencias tengan acceso a la información. Muchos de estos periodistas asesinados y asesinadas en los últimos años, fuera de las zonas de conflicto, estaban trabajando y tratando en temas y denuncias medioambientales y delitos políticos. Entonces, ¿qué desafío trae para nuestras democracias las amenazas a la seguridad de los periodistas? Cuanto más se ven afectadas las periodistas mujeres, ya sea por la violencia analógica como digital. ¿Qué amenazas enfrentamos? En tiempos de digitalización e inteligencia artificial, las y los periodistas enfrentan un sinnúmero de peligros online y offline. Las mujeres periodistas en particular, y lo hemos escuchado en este panel de conversación, muchas veces somos víctimas de acoso, difamación, amenaza física y sexual, intimidaciones y agresiones. Esta violencia proviene de actores que se ven perjudicados en sus intereses a través de las denuncias. Al amenazar a una periodista o a un periodista, se amenaza a la comunidad completa y el derecho a la información que tiene la ciudadanía en cada uno de nuestros países, amedrentando así la acción del periodismo y devaluando la calidad de nuestras democracias. Por eso lo que hemos escuchado en el panel, en esta última discusión respecto a la necesaria coordinación de los distintos entes que tenemos que ver respecto a la política pública, se hace fundamental. La diversidad y equilibrio de los ecosistemas de medios que combinan la mirada global con componentes locales también son claves al momento de traducir situaciones complejas en un lenguaje cercano y comprensible, que tenga un real impacto en cada una de las comunidades. Nuestras audiencias son diversas, por lo que el desafío de promover ecosistemas de medios que conecten procesos globales con situaciones locales y con sus urgencias se hace fundamental. En este sentido, creemos firmemente que Latinoamérica plantea enormes desafíos. Las luchas de las comunidades locales e indígenas, por ejemplo, en el cuidado del medio ambiente y las fuentes de desarrollo sustentables, enfrentadas a la amenaza extractivista de empresas multinacionales que actúan en el contexto de estados indolentes y empobrecidos, nos lleva a preguntarnos sobre el rol de los medios y los periodistas. Cómo contribuir al desarrollo de estas comunidades, la conservación de sus espacios, sus historias y sus tradiciones sin poner en juego el desarrollo económico de nuestros países del sur del mundo. Finalmente, el desarrollo de la inteligencia artificial en un contexto de desinformación digital también nos ofrece grandes posibilidades de discusión y debate. La automatización del periodismo a través del desarrollo de nuevos softwares ha generado la aparición y la publicación de noticias que prescinden de todo filtro editorial de seres humanos. Así se han generado contenidos falsos de alto realismo. La inteligencia artificial tiene la capacidad de difundir este tipo de noticias y contenidos a gran escala de manera muy rápida y al mismo tiempo de manera muy focalizada, dirigida a públicos muy específicos. Pero la inteligencia artificial también nos ofrece oportunidades únicas, a las que nunca tuvimos acceso para investigar y difundir contenidos periodísticos de gran interés común. Con estas nuevas herramientas podemos analizar el gran número de datos, identificando, por ejemplo, en el ámbito medioambiental, patrones climáticos y anticipando los eventos extremos y desastres naturales. En los últimos años hemos enfrentado en nuestro país, en Chile, situaciones de crisis y movilizaciones sociales, lo que nos ha llevado a abordar enormes desafíos sobre cómo generar más y mejores herramientas que nos permitan a los periodistas y comunicadores y comunicadoras desarrollar su trabajo en las calles sin el riesgo de ser golpeados, amenazados o incluso asesinados. En esta amplia agenda de trabajo con la que nos hemos comprometido como Gobierno de Chile, hemos llevado a cabo en conjunto con UNESCO, donde se han propuesto capacitaciones y procesos de intercambio. Hasta el resultado más relevante de este proceso, el patrocinio, y la presentación de indicaciones al proyecto de ley de periodistas, de protección a periodistas y personas trabajadoras de las comunicaciones. El proyecto de ley que que mientras estamos hablando está siendo discutido en el Congreso Nacional, tiene por objeto proteger a aquellas personas que ejercen labores en el ámbito de las comunicaciones, en tanto bien jurídico que coayuda a garantizar el derecho a la libertad de expresión y a la información, además del acceso a la información de interés público. Así se le reconoce a los trabajadores y trabajadoras de las comunicaciones como defensores de los derechos humanos y, por tanto, de la democracia. Dicha medida permite cumplir con los estándares internacionales que ha puesto la UNESCO en estas materias. Este proyecto, que es inédito en nuestro país, podría convertirse en un referente para toda América Latina. Se trata de una iniciativa pionera en la región en materia de protección a periodistas, profesionales y trabajadores y trabajadoras de las comunicaciones. De aprobarse, como esperamos que así sea, mucho antes además, que sea promulgado antes de la celebración del Día Mundial de la Libertad de Prensa en nuestro país el próximo año, va a ser un modelo que servirá de guía como estatuto de protección a la labor periodística de todos los países de la región y esperamos que también en diversas realidades del mundo entero. Como les dije, ha sido para mí un honor y un privilegio estar acá, escuchar los desafíos que hemos tenido en los distintos paneles y darnos cuenta de la gran posibilidad de colaboración que tenemos, tanto los gobiernos como los distintos entes que participan en la política pública para fortalecer el periodismo, para asegurar y garantizar la libertad de la prensa y también proteger los intereses comunes que tenemos como fervientes creyentes que la democracia es el único camino por el cual pueden transitar nuestros distintos pueblos. Muchísimas gracias.
So in the interest of time, you'll be relieved to know I will not do a recap of what we've all said, but I want to say a big thank you to the panel for their really interesting and varied insights. A thank you to the audience for sticking with us until the end, and a thank you to the guest speakers. The most important thing is there is now a reception, a closing ceremony at the Art Museum of the Americas. So hopefully we'll see you there. Thank you.
So we're supposed to move on after this.